Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades. Welcome to African History Club. This is now episode number 50. Yes, 50. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. Today's podcast is a bit special, different from all the previous podcasts. It's going to be focusing on one of our columnists for Black Star News, which is, of course, my publication. This columnist is based in Uganda. He's a young Ugandan writer, 33 years old. He is a prominent critic of the Ugandan dictatorship that's been in power for 36 years now, under General Yoweri Museveni, and supported by U.S. taxpayers' dollars to the tune of $1 billion annually, plus weapons for his military, plus joint training between his army and U.S. Army. Kakwenza Rukirabashaija is his name. Kakwenza, in the last 2 years, has been arrested 3 times because of his writing. He's been tortured on all 3 occasions. The last arrest, in which he endured the most horrific torture, was December 28. He was released after persistent global outcry, including several editorials that I wrote, including several calls and reach out to the State Department. And of course, the State Department is important because the regime would not be able to survive without the military, diplomatic, and financial assistance from the United States. Kakwenza is also the awardee of what is known as the PEN International Writer of Courage. The award was given to Kakwenza last year. So he was the Writer of Courage 2021, PEN International. So PEN also organized a global campaign, and because he was a recipient of that award, that also attracted much media coverage to his plight. But people who are not familiar with Kakwenza, I urge you to research, look up, Google his name. And in this instance, I'll just give you the spelling of his first name. Kakwenza, Kakwenza. So search Kakwenza and Uganda and torture, and then you'll see several stories. Some of the best coverage: The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and a couple of African publications. And we also had extensive coverage. And then there were other outlets such as BBC, DW, which is a German outlet. So after you Google for the articles, also Google under image, and you'll see the photograph that's now become viral. And it's the photograph of the horrific scarifications, deep scars on his back from the torture he endured by the military establishment in Uganda. Because Uganda is essentially a military regime under General Museveni, semi-clothed in civilian attire, but for all practical purposes, it's a military dictatorship that we have in Uganda. The scarification on his back is so horrific that when he showed it to some of the Western diplomats, including the United States ambassador to Uganda, Natalie Brown, before he left the country, is so horrific that some of them actually shed tears. The scarification resembles the ugly, horrific black and white picture of the back of a formerly enslaved African here in the United States. It's not quite to that extent, but it reminds you of that iconic photograph. And you will see what I mean once you Google and you go under images and you see the photograph of Kakwenza's back. In addition to that, he described other tortures he endured while in captivity. And that was another gruesome form of torture. His tormentors used pliers to pluck off flesh from his legs, from his thighs, from his butt, from his feet. Pliers, just plucking off the flesh. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he said he had never heard of this gruesome form of torture. And then I reminded him that I actually mentioned this type of torture in my book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. There's a chapter where I discuss the kind of torture that the British colonial establishment inflicted on Kenyans, nationalists, who were fighting for their independence under the banner of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The British derogatively referred to them as Mau Mau. And they used that same procedure, plucking off flesh from the victims, using the pliers, in addition to applying it on their genitals as well, and other gruesome forms of torture. And this is the same pattern that the US-backed dictatorship in Uganda is applying to the torture victims. So why has Kakwenza endured the wrath of this regime and the multiple torture? Well, the first time he was arrested was in 2020, after he published a novel under the title The Greedy Barbarian, about a corrupt, ruthless dictator in a fictitious African country. So General Yoweri Museveni obviously read the book, and he saw too much similarities. Kakwenza was arrested by an outfit called the Chieftaincy of Military Intelligence. You know, they always have these dramatic names. He was tortured on that occasion, including waterboarding, including tied up while standing with his arms upraised, chained to a crossbar, and made to stand all night in that position, beaten all over his body, kicked all over his body, and asked about the book that he had written, The Greedy Barbarian. After much outcry, and we were also involved in that in 2020, and after persistence, we got some strong statements from the US State Department also demanding for his release. And there was some international coverage as well. The regime is so dependent on its foreign backers that occasionally it does pay attention to what is being said internationally. doesn't really care about what is said in Uganda. It's the typical neo-colonial regime that Nkrumah described in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, where he says the West will support regimes that are not accountable to its citizens. Has no regard at all, because it does not depend on the consent of Ugandans. So long as it maintains the neo-colonial relationship with countries like Britain and the new post-colonial imperial power in Africa now, which is, of course, the United States. So Kakwenza was released after that first arrest, following the publication of his fiction book, The Greedy Barbarian. Kakwenza is a writer. And many of you who are writers know that writers just cannot stop themselves. So even after enduring that vicious torture, Kakwenza continued to write, continued writing columns for Black Star News. And I must admit, I felt conflicted, because a part of me felt that I would somehow be responsible if the critical writing that he was submitting and I was published on a weekly basis should once again get him in trouble. He was also very active on social media, posting critical comments on Facebook, tweeting, and on other media platforms critical of the US-backed dictatorship in Uganda, particularly after last year's rigged presidential election, which was stolen from the main challenger, Bobi Wine, by the dictator Museveni. But in 2020, Kakwenza, after his release, also wrote a second book, Banana Republic, where writing is treasonous. And he described the torture he endured after his first arrest. And we serialized that book in Black Star News. And once again, he was arrested for the second time. Once again, tortured. Once again, much international outcry. And once again, he was released. And then last year, he won the PEN International Award for the Writer of Courage 2021. And then ultimately, he was arrested in December, on December the 28th. And that followed a couple of tweets by Kakwenza. And one of them referred to General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is the son of dictator Museveni, as an obese general. General Muhoozi is the commander of land forces in Uganda. So Uganda essentially has a Papa Doc and Baby Doc type dictatorship, as Haiti once endured under Francois Duvalier, and then later when his son succeeded him, Jean-Claude Duvalier. That is what Uganda has today. Dictator Museveni and his son, General Muhoozi, sometimes referred to as the deputy dictator, or Baby Doc, by Ugandans. So Kakwenza was arrested once again after that tweet, and then endured this horrific, the most horrific torture that had ever been inflicted on him. Initially, a judge had ordered his immediate release, unconditional. And of course, in a dictatorship like Uganda's, there's really only one authority, and that is the dictator himself, Museveni, and the deputy dictator, Muhoozi. So that order was ignored. And they continued the torture. And word got out of the severity of his injuries because his lawyer managed to get access to the prison and observed the serious wounds on Kakwenza. We interviewed the lawyer on my weekly radio show on WBAI 99.5 FM New York radio, on my Black Star News radio show. And he described the nature of the injuries. Just listening to it was horrific. And he made an appeal that people should join in protesting on social media because he feared that Kakwenza would be killed. And ultimately, the global attention led to his release on bail last week. And he has still been facing charges of posting offensive communication. So we have this Stalinist kind of situation where the victim of horrific torture is the one that is being charged and tried for a crime. Now, I also need to mention that Kakwenza's case is not unique. The arrest, kidnapping, torture, and killing of young males in particular in Uganda escalated after last year's stolen election, where the regime just went out on a campaign to try to cow the populace, trying to preempt what it believes could be potentially lead to a popular uprising after an election that was overwhelmingly won by Bobi Wine, who was 38 years old at that time, and hugely supported by the majority of the country, because Uganda is a very young country. More than 80% of the population is under the age of 35. So that is why they voted overwhelmingly for Bobi Wine and against General Museveni. So after those elections last January, the secret police and the military launched a campaign of mass arrest of young people. People would be kidnapped from their homes or just on the streets, bundled into cars, unmarked cars with no license plates, by armed men in civilian attire. And that campaign of kidnapping, torture, and killings has actually been widely covered, even by the corporate media. That's how serious and pervasive it was. So it was covered by the BBC, by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, and also covered by publications that have consistently been covering the crimes by the regime, which, as I mentioned earlier, are The Guardian and Al Jazeera. So it's been covered. Kakwenza's case has now gained this prominence because of the recognition he had received by PEN International. Otherwise, he might have been one of those individuals kidnapped last year, tortured, killed, and whose bodies have been discovered dumped in various forests in Uganda. So I think the PEN Award and the publicity that it generated is what saved Kakwenza's life. So when he was released on bail last week, the people that love him said, "Yes, we know you are courageous, but you're not safe in Uganda anymore." And here is one of the saddest parts of this episode, to me personally. After Kakwenza managed to get out of Uganda, as I speak to you, he's still in an African country. He's trying to make it overseas so he can get treatment for the serious physical and psychological wounds that he suffered. But I managed to have a conversation with him, a brief conversation. And he told me that as he was being tortured, one of the questions his tormentors kept asking him was, "How do you know Milton Alimadi? Why do you write for Black Star News when you know that publication is very critical of this government?" So to me, it brought a profound sadness. But this is what he also told me. He said, "Milton, writing is what I do. They will never stop me from writing." That is Kakwenza. Now, my final word on this matter is, my American friends, sisters and brothers, these atrocities would not be accomplished without your taxpayers' dollars. This is when people can actually contact their elected representatives, members of Congress, members of the House and senators, and send them an image of Kakwenza's back, which you can retrieve very easily. And you can retrieve any one of the accounts in any of the media outlets that's covered this case and send it to your elected representative and say, "Not with my tax dollars." That's one way we can really fight imperialism and neo-colonialism in Africa. When people in this country also take an interest in the matter and actually decide that I can do something about it, and I will do something about it. One final observation. I've launched a GoFundMe campaign on behalf of Kakwenza with a target of $3,000. And I'm happy to say that in the last 3 weeks, we've now been able to raise almost $2,000. So we are close to our goal. So anybody that is interested, and of course, I'll post the link as well on my Patreon page. Anybody that is interested in supporting this campaign, please go to GoFundMe.com, and just search the name Kakwenza, and you'll see that campaign under my name, Milton Alimadi. And once again, Kakwenza is spelled Kakwenza. Thank you so much. And I'll be back soon with our regular topics and conversation. Stay strong, stay Pan-African.